In our last episode, we began our series on God and government, looking at the relationship between the two. And what we explored first was the basis of divine authority and the basis of human authority. And looking at how human authority really only has any weight if it is flowing from divine authority. If it's not coming from God, then it's just simply might makes right. Now, in this video, we're going to be dealing with the question of, does God appoint political rulers? Now, the reason why we ask that question is because if the answer is no, then it's simply that God is sitting on the sidelines and we're choosing our rulers and we're getting what we get from that. On the other hand, if the answer is yes, then what we'd have to say is that God is in fact having a hand in those who would actually come into power throughout the course of human history. Now, before we move on to answering that question, I do think it's important to answer the question of, did God always intend that human beings would have authority over each other? And opinions may vary here, but I think the answer is yes. And the reason why I think that is because of what Jesus has to say and what we see in the book of Revelation. I think on the basis of those passages, it's clear that human rule over others is not the result of the fall. And the reason for that is because we see that continuing on into the age to come, in which there is no sin. So in Matthew 25:21, in the parable of the stewards, Jesus has the master saying to one of the good servants, he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over little. I will set you over much." Now, that might just be material possessions belonging to the master, but it could also include people, having authority over people, those who are part of the household of the master. Now, the case for this gains a little bit more weight once we turn to Revelation. In Revelation 2, verses 26 through 27, Jesus says this to the church of Thyatira. He says, "The one who conquers and who keeps my works unto the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father." So Jesus has received authority from the Father, and Jesus is giving authority to those who are believers, to Christians. At the end of the book of Revelation 20, verse 4a, John says that I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Now, this is a vision that is fulfilling the words that were spoken to John and the other disciples in Matthew 19:28, when Jesus told the 12 that they would sit on thrones in judgment over the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, so setting that aside, I think it is the case that God has intended that human beings would always have these sorts of positions of authority. When we go to the Old Testament, we are entering a situation in which this is after the fall. We are talking about a sinful world here. But there is a unique relationship that God has with the people of Israel. And he has more of a direct hand in the course of that nation as he's positioned himself as their direct king. Now, that's not to say that there aren't human intermediaries involved, because there are judges who are put in place. And the first and most prominent of them is Moses. And in Exodus 18, verses 13 through 16, we have Moses explaining his role to his father-in-law, Jethro, who's concerned about all the work that he's doing because he's taken on a lot. And Moses says this in verses 15 and 16, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws." So in his role as judge, Moses is communicating God's legislation to the people of Israel, and he's determining whether someone's in the right, in the wrong, based on how they've conducted themselves in any set of circumstances. Now, what's interesting is that even during this time, it's anticipated that Israel would desire a human king, and they would get their kings. But God makes clear his continued authority, and he also makes it clear that human rulers are going to have their shortcomings. So in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 15, again, this is anticipated. And in verse 15, he says, "You may indeed set a king over you," but then it says this, "whom the Lord your God will choose." So God's still having a hand in all of this. In 1 Samuel 8, Samuel goes to the Lord, says the people are demanding a king. God says, okay, but you're going to give them this warning. Verse 9, "You shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." And Samuel goes on to explain to the people how their king is basically going to take advantage of them in all sorts of ways. But as far as this man who would be the king of Israel is concerned, God's going to have a hand in choosing who he is. In 1 Samuel 9, verse 16, God directs Samuel to Saul, who would be this first king. He says, "Tomorrow about this time I will send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people, Israel." But God's supervision of human rulers is not just limited to Israel. It extends to all the rulers of the world. And we see this very clearly in the case of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. In Jeremiah 27, verses 5 through 6, the Lord tells his people this through the prophet. It says, "It is I who by my great power and my outstretched arm have made the earth, with the men and animals that are on the earth, and I give it to whomever it seems right to me." So that's kind of the basic principle there. Everything belongs to God. He's created everything, and he gives authority to whomever it seems right to him. And then it goes on in verse 6, and he says, "I'm giving this authority to King Nebuchadnezzar." Now in Daniel 4, what's interesting is we see this kind of come back on Nebuchadnezzar when he begins to think that he came into this authority by his own strength, his own majesty. And as a result, God curses him with madness. He begins to eat grass from like he's an ox. And eventually this passes away once he's humbled. But the way in which he would be humbled would be this. God says in verse 32, "Until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." So whether it's an Israelite king or whether it's a Gentile king, God is the one putting them in positions of power and authority. And we see Jesus recognize the propriety of this authority in Matthew 22, verses 17 through 21. He's put to a test as to whether the people need to pay taxes to Caesar or not. And the reason why they pose this question, some of the religious leaders, is because they want to trap Jesus so that if he says they have to pay taxes, he'd be unpopular with the people. If he says don't pay taxes, he's a rebel. Jesus says, well, look who's on the coin. It's Caesar's coin. And so he says in verse 21, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's." So there's some propriety there. He's saying this properly belongs to Caesar based on his position of authority, and to God the things that are God's. Now, the passage that most clearly articulates God's establishment of government is found in Romans 13. Paul says there, in the first couple of verses, he makes it absolutely clear. He says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God." So that goes to our first video. All authority comes from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. So that goes to this video. God's the one appointing these leaders. "Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." And then you go down through the next few verses, and he says that the person serving in this role of authority is God's servant. He is a minister of God. And he says in verse 7, "Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Now, of course, we can imagine situations in which maybe that would seem to be called into question. What happens when a ruler goes bad? Now, when we go to some parallel situations of human authority, we can see grounds for that authority being overturned. We think about parents, we think about marriage. When we look at parents who are abusing their children or telling them to do things that are wrong, in those cases, the children should disobey their parents, maybe even be taken away from their parents. In the case of a marriage in which a spouse is abusing their partner, well, in the case of the husband, especially, who has this headship role, regardless, if he's abusing his wife, she should leave him. I believe that's grounds for divorce. And this just reminds us that human authority, as I showed you in this graph before, human authority is not absolute. It's only God's authority that is absolute. And so when it comes to human government, we can imagine there being cases in which those who've been put in positions of authority ultimately forfeit their legitimacy when they don't act in accordance with God's will. Now, what does that look like then? How is that person removed? Various theologians have given their thoughts on this. The medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas prescribes that, well, if the person's been put in their position by a higher authority, you appeal to that higher authority. If he's been put into power by the community of people, well, the people have the power to remove that person from authority. Sometimes, though, you're not going to have the ability to remove that person from power, and it's only in God's power to remove that person. And ultimately, that's actually what's the case, as we've seen here. God's the one who puts people in these positions, and he has the power to remove them as well. Which leads us to ask, why would God allow someone who's a tyrant, who's abusing power, to come into authority? Well, Aquinas has some thoughts on this. This is in his treatise De Regimine Principum on the Rule of Princes. He says this: "Nor indeed is his hand now so weakened that he cannot set his people free from a tyrant. For he," again we're talking about God here, "promised his people through Isaiah that he would give them rest from their labor and confusion and from the harsh bondage in which they served. And through Ezekiel he said, I will deliver my flock from their mouth, that is, from those shepherds who feed only themselves. But if men are to deserve such benefit from God, they must cease from sin, because it is a punishment for their sin that ungodly men are given power over them. For the Lord says through Hosea, I gave thee a king in my anger. And at Job 34:30, it is said that he maketh a man who is an hypocrite to rule because of the people's sin. Guilt, therefore, must be first taken away, so that the scourge of tyranny may cease." So what is Aquinas saying there? Aquinas is saying that it may be that God is allowing for this person to be in power because of the sins of the people. You're basically getting the ruler that you deserve. So this should give us some perspective when we have complaints about our political leaders. It may be that God is giving us the sorts of leaders that we deserve because of the sins of our society. Now, we should be careful to not rush to call those that are maybe politicians that we don't like, calling them tyrants. Just because we don't like them doesn't make them a tyrant. The way that we can come to that determination as to whether someone's really truly flouting God's purpose for government is by understanding, well, what is God's idea of good government? What does good government look like? So that's what we're going to be exploring in the next video. And this is important not only for those who would be political leaders, but for us thinking about Americans who are citizens of a democracy. We have a hand in determining what sort of government we're going to have. And so it's important that we understand what that looks like. So catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Encourage you to subscribe to the channel so you can get our latest videos. Also encourage you to join us on November 1st when we have our supper discussion on this subject. If you sign up with our text line, you'll get that information directly. Otherwise, keep an eye out on future videos for more details about letting us know that you're going to be joining us.